Hello and welcome to the Investing Insiders podcast, where we help you to create financial well-being by making smarter money decisions. This episode is sponsored by Saxo Markets. So millions of people in the UK could be at risk of not building up enough in their pensions to afford a comfortable retirement. So in this episode, we're going to be recapping some of the highlights from our conversations with pensions experts. So up first is our conversation with Sir Steve Webb. He was a former pensions minister and is a partner at consulting firm Lane, Clark and Peacock. He played a huge role in shaping the pension system we have today and has some great insights as to why you need to be taking your pension savings a step further. You've been instrumental in some of the biggest changes to the pension system, particularly around the introduction of the triple lock, which we'll dig into a bit later. What would be great as a starting point is to have a look into your experience and how you think we are as a nation in terms of saving for pensions. Are we putting enough aside?
I think most of us aren't putting enough aside. That would be my starting point. And we're going through a sea change at the moment. If I think of my parents' generation, they had a lot of certainty. They had a state pension at, in my dad's case, 65, in my mom's case, 60. That hadn't changed for 100 years. I mean, that was been very static. My dad worked for businesses that had a company pension that paid actually when he was 65 as well. My mom worked in local government, so she had a local government pension, and they had to make virtually no decisions of their own. So they got a state pension when they reached pension age. They got their company, their workplace pensions. Those pensions lasted as long as they did, were protected against inflation. They didn't have to worry about the stock market, choose investments, none of that. If I think about my children's generation, so I'm 60 now, so if I kind of roll forward to the next generation down, they'll have none of that. If they work in the private sector, they will have a state pension, which will probably be paid at 68, 69, maybe 70, come back to that. And then they'll have a pot of money, or lots of pots. We come back to that. But, and they'll have to decide how that grows. And obviously a lot of that's done for you, but you have to think about that, when to take it, how to take it. So we really have shifted a huge amount of onus onto individuals. Many of us, ordinary people with lives to lead, haven't necessarily got the skills to deal with all of this. So it's a big shift.
Do you feel that that shift has been a necessary part of us adjusting to, our economic climate and it's a natural progression? Or is it the case that actually things used to just work a lot better and we've kind of gone backwards a bit?
We have gone backwards a bit in the sense that, if you go back to the 60s, the 70s and so on, a company might look after its best paid employees pretty well. We're mostly talking men. Often women couldn't even join the scheme in some cases, or part-timers couldn't. So there's a lot of gender inequality in all of this. But, if you were in a good job with a good company and they set up one of these pension schemes for you, that was great. That was to die for. And what's gradually happened over time is the cost of providing those pensions has got more and more expensive. Although there are interruptions to this, we're living longer, compared with when these schemes are set up, living far longer. Governments have laid rules and regulations on top and said, well, if you provide a pension, you've got to protect against inflation. And that's very expensive. So companies who freely, voluntarily offered these pensions to some of their workers suddenly said, well, hang on a minute, this is expensive, it's volatile, I don't know from one year to the next what it's going to cost, people are living longer, it's unpredictable, I'm not having this. So they pulled out, they pulled the plug. And then what they've replaced it with is broader. So, things like automatic enrolment, which now means essentially you earn 10,000 a year, your employer has to put you in a pension. That's broadened coverage massively, but the average amount people have got has dropped calamitously. So far, far more people have got pensions full stop. But for most people, they're just at the start, the foothills, really.
It's really interesting, the sort of shift in, I suppose, responsibility and taking care of your retirement package when you decide to stop working. One of the things you touched on was the element of the state pension. And it would be great to hear your thoughts on what proportion of somebody's pension makeup should the state pension be?
I mean, in many ways, the new state pension, I should declare an interest because I kind of designed it, was intended to be simpler than what went before. So we used to have a really complicated state pension system. You had a basic pension and an earnings-related bit on top, and you could opt out of that. Nobody knew what they were going to get. The new system is designed to be broadly flat rates. So from April, it will be about £12,500 a year. And most people retiring from now on will get that figure. They won't get less, they won't get more. That's what they will get. Now, if you come into the UK halfway through your working life, it's different. You know, there are gaps, but most people, and a nice feature of the new system is for men and for women, the number is essentially identical. And you might think, well, of course it should be, and of course it should be, but historically it hasn't been. Historically, married women in particular had much worse state pensions, and part of the point of the new reform was to treat men and women essentially the same. So give or take 1% or 2%, the average man, the average woman is going to get that figure. So that's kind of the good news. We have certainty that that's the sort of figure to expect, 12,500 in today's money. Now, question, Brian, you asked is, well, how much of your retirement income should that make up? And a lot depends on what you've been used to before you were retired. So if you've been earning 15,000 a year steadily, you know, perhaps that's a low paid job or a part-time job or whatever, 12,500 is pretty good. Because once you're retired, you're not paying national insurance, maybe you haven't got a mortgage, you've got childcare, travel to 12,500 quid is what you've been living on. So if that's all you've got, the pension gets you all the way. If you've been on 50,000 a year, you don't want to go down to 12.5. So actually what you need depends a lot on what you've been used to. And the whole point of pensions, it's not just about keeping you out of poverty. It's about enabling your standard of living to keep going when you don't have a wage anymore. In that case, the more you've been used to earning, the more you've got to provide for yourself to top up the basic state pension.
I think that raises quite an interesting point about the state pension and what it potentially could evolve into. We obviously had a shift between the sort of old version of the state pension into the new state pension. Do you see any more changes coming into how it's provided, what it might look like, and when those shifts might kick in?
I think the biggest obvious change will be the age at which you can get it. So we know starting this April 2026, that the pension age will rise gradually from 66 to reach 67 by April 2028. So it doesn't go by a year overnight, it goes by a month and a month and a month. So there'll be some people whose pension age is 66 years and 2 months or something like that. So it goes up gradually. So by April 2028, it'll be 67. The government is doing a state pension age review as we speak. We already know there is a date for going to 68, which is in the mid-2040s. That will almost certainly be brought forward. And it would be surprising if people in their 20s and 30s weren't expected to work till 69 or 70 or something of that sort. So I think ages, as around the world, in fact, will continue to go up. The other big change, I think, will be, we mentioned the triple lock. So this is a very generous rule which says every year how much rise do pensioners get? Well, they could get inflation, so they can always buy the same basket of goods in the shops. They could get the average wage rise that a worker's had. So if pensions are meant to keep track of what you used to earn, then if people in work get 5%, pensioners get 5%. So it's always the same proportion. And then sometimes both of those numbers are very, very low. So I remember back in the day, prices went up by 1% or something, wages less than that. And that gave pensioners a 75p increase. And there was, not quite rioting in the streets, but there was a lot of fuss. And so that's where this idea of a 2.5% minimum increase comes from, that you'll never get pennies. You will always get something. And those are the three elements of the triple lock. Now, I put the triple lock in place in about 2011. It's been going for 15 years, partly to undo the damage of the previous 30 years when the pension only went up by prices. And the point about that is for those 30 years, if wages were rising faster than prices, which they usually did, the pension was falling further and further behind what people have been used to earning. And as we said earlier, what you want is a pension that keeps tabs with what you used to earn, not falls behind. So the triple lock was trying to mend something. So I make no apology for it or for 15 years of it, but there will come a point when it stops. There has to be a point where it stops, at which point it'll probably be linked to the average wage or something like that.
Are we at that point?
More or less, I suspect. I mean, people say, oh, it's ruinously expensive, we can't possibly afford it. But it depends compared with what? Because yes, we could have a really cheap state pension. We could link back to inflation. And then we've just started to talk about how the fact that most people haven't got decent private pensions. So if we take our foot off the gas on the state pension and drastically reduce the increase on the state pension, and people haven't got decent private pensions, there's only one thing that will happen is people end up poor in retirement. And that's not a great outcome either.
A lot of people do grapple with priorities, particularly in their 20s and 30s. What do you prioritize? Putting money aside for retirement or trying to, get onto the property ladder and have an asset that you say can stop you from private renting later on? So it's quite interesting to kind of hear that as a potential strategy. I suppose when thinking about making sure that you have enough for retirement, I suppose the plan might change depending on how old you are. But as a general set of tips, what would you suggest people do when trying to make sure that they have enough in their pot so they have a comfortable time when they decide to stop working?
I think this is going to get a bit easier in the coming years to at least think about, because we probably next year we will have something called, that you're familiar with, a pensions dashboard. If you lived in the Netherlands or Sweden or Australia, you have that now. And the idea is you can go on a website, probably an app, and see all of your pensions, your state pensions, your pensions from different jobs in one place. And that will give you a forecast, a projection of what you've got and what that will turn into at retirement. And that will start that process of thinking, well, I've only got this much. I think I probably need twice that or whatever. And then you can start to put in place a plan. And that plan's different for everyone, single, part of a couple, a homeowner, renter, the industry, the pensions industry says people should save about 12% of their pay a year, of which a good chunk could come from the employer. So it's not you have to save 12%, it's 12% needs to go in. That's a rule of thumb. But to be honest, the best thing to do is look at yourself, what you've got, what jobs you've had, what your expectations are. And I always say when you go on a journey, the first thing is to know where you're starting from. And too many people just don't even know where they're starting from. So I think the dashboard and, people such as yourselves, dare I mention Martin Lewis and others, will promote the dashboard. Millions of people will go to it, partly because people will find pensions they never knew they had. It'd be like a treasure trove. I constantly hear from members of the public who tell me about jobs they had 20, 30 years ago, and they just don't know where the pension went. And there'll be so many good news stories. And I think that will be a real trigger for engagement.
So how far off is this dashboard?
Well, people get very weary because they've been hearing about it approximately forever. But in fact, if you think about, I don't know if you can remember old style tellies that had real spaghetti at the back and all the different cables and all the rest of it. And the dashboard is like that telly with all the cables going into the back, but nobody's switched it on yet. So the cables are the information. And most information about most pensions is now plugged into the back of the telly. That's been done. What they're doing now is testing it. So people have literally switched it on in a quiet room, had a look, tested it, see how people reacted, then they're going to give it to more people to test. So all of this takes time and you want to do it right. But I would be surprised if by the end of next year, probably, they haven't switched it on or thereabouts. And given how long we've been waiting, we're nearly there, I think.
We also spoke to pensions experts Sarah Pennells and Clare Moffatt from Royal London. They helped paint a picture about the reality of pension savings in the UK and why the state pension might not go as far as you think. How good are we in the UK at saving for retirement? What does the landscape look like at the moment?
I think it's quite a mixed bag, really. I think the short answer is that we're a lot better now than we would have been if we didn't have automatic enrolment from 2012. So, anybody who's employed, who's between the age of 22 and state pension age and who earns £10,000 or more from that job, instead of having to fill in paperwork and think, do I join my employer's pension scheme? Do I not join? Do I join now? Do I not join? They get plonked into it. And that started to be phased in from 2012, as I'm sure lots of your listeners are aware. But I think the figures around what it's achieved are quite interesting because there are about 22 million people who are either employed or indeed on a contract who are saving for their retirement now through a workplace pension. And before 2012, that was 10 million. So more than double. So I think from that point of view, tick, 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 automatic enrolment has made a big difference and got people who otherwise wouldn't have joined their employer's pension scheme to start saving. But I think in terms of, if you broaden it out and think, well, are we a nation of people who, we love our pensions. We think they're absolutely marvelous. And being, I guess, more serious, do we really think about what we might need in retirement? Do we sort of check in with our pensions? Do we think about, actually, what do I need to be saving? I think sort of, I think the answer is probably some people do, definitely, but not everybody does. And we do a lot of research we have done over the years, focusing on things like cost of living and financial resilience and workplace pensions, as you would expect. And there are a couple of stats that sort of leapt out at me. One is that almost 7 in 10 adults say they don't know how much is in their pension pot. So that's quite, I think it's quite a sobering stat. So I think if you think about, yes, we are, particularly people who are employed or on a contract, most of us now are saving for retirement. But, and it's a big but, people who are self-employed, there's no similar scheme. So it's down to you to work out whether you can afford to save, how much, how to go about it, all that kind of stuff. And then I think if you look at how much is being saved, we know that lots of people are asking questions about whether this 8% that goes into your pension, from your employer tax-free, is that enough to give you the retirement that you want? And for most people, that answer is no.
I'm sure many people listening will know how, that 8% is made up, but is it useful to kind of explain exactly how that does work? And because we get lots of questions about this and people thinking that 8% is something that they have to pay. So, just to kind of explain, it's 4% of your salary comes from you as an employee. Then your employer pays in 3%. Now that's from their own money, and then 1% comes from the government in the form of tax relief. So that's like a top up from the government. Now, these are the minimum amounts. Your employer might pay in more. I think it's really important to say that staying in your pension is really important. You might think that seems like a lot of money, but if you don't pay in, your employer's not going to pay in, and you're not going to get that tax relief from the government. And I think, when we start thinking about this and digging into it in a bit more detail, this is really important. And you benefit from compound interest, which we always talk about as being the magic of time, really. And, Sarah was talking about that this has been a benefit to millions of employees. It's also worth saying that there's lots of people who are self-employed who don't have access to auto-enrollment. And if you've got multiple jobs and they're all under £10,000, then you won't be automatically enrolled as well. So I think there's people missing out on contributions, and, that means that it's affecting those on a low income in particular. And also, there's potential reforms to auto-enrollment. That's quite key, because if we bring in more low-paid and part-time workers, and if many of these people are women, then that's a good thing. And, we want people to have a good retirement and enjoy the things that they currently enjoy. And so having more in their pension is important.
I think a lot of people do have questions about the state pension and what it is, how much they're going to get, when they're going to get it. And, for most people, let's be honest, it is the foundation of their income in retirement, no matter how much or how little they have on top. So at the moment, for people getting the full new state pension, which is those who reach state pension age after kind of April 2016, come April, the state pension amount is going to increase to kind of around about £12,500 a year. But it's not going to give the kind of income that most people will need or want for the lifestyle they want in retirement. And a few years ago, I and 5 of our customers tried to live on the state pension just for a week, but just to get a sense of actually what are the kind of decisions that I would have to make, and the customers who joined me, if we did just have the state pension. So try to be, obviously it was just for a week, so quite a short term, but try to be as accurate as possible about the kind of costs that we might have in retirement, and sort of drew up a budget and all this kind of stuff. And I remember the first day that I went to the shops. I just went to the local supermarket, and I had my list of things that I was going to buy. And I got to the till, and I'd worked out how much I wanted to spend first, my initial shop, which I would then top up later in the week. But this was at a time when inflation was quite high. It was a few years ago. And I was going to spend sort of £2.50 more on my first day than I planned, which doesn't sound like much. But at the time, I think the full state pension was around just under £200 a week or something like that. So that was quite a lot from how much I planned. And I actually I remember sort of standing at the till thinking, should I put this back? Do I go kind of over my budget on day one? This feels I've only been living on the state pension for 3 hours. This feels like a really bad, a really bad way to kind of run this experiment. So, I mean, looking back at the week, technically I survived for a week and I had a little bit of money left over, but I ate completely differently. I mean, I just wasn't buying the sort of food. And I don't mean, buying luxury, running up and down the high street buying lobster, which I wasn't doing that week. I just had, not as much variety in the food. I made a conscious effort to do free and low cost things. And although I couldn't save, I just didn't have any money left over for those kind of emergencies. And at the time I had 2 dogs. I have one now, but although I could afford to feed them on the state pension, I couldn't afford to get vet treatment or to pay for insurance. And that made me think, because, when I eventually do retire, I want to have 1 dog, maybe I want to have 2, but to not be able to get them treated if anything happens. And one of them was very sadly completely accident prone. So, we have our own seat at the vets virtually. But it was quite a sobering thought that actually I wasn't necessarily somebody who wanted to go on a cruise, 3 or 4 times a year, but I did want to have a dog and not worry about being able to pay the bills. So, £12,500, I think for most people, that is not enough to give them the kind of lifestyle they want. And in fact, I mentioned the figures earlier on of people telling us they want £32,500 or £58,000 a year, depending on how you calculate the average. I think the other thing to say is, although that is the full amount, if you've paid national insurance for 35 years or been credited with it, our research showed, we did a Freedom of Information request a couple of years ago, which showed that only half of adults reaching state pension age that year got the full amount. So we keep talking about this figure of, 12,000 or 12,500, but many people don't even get that. They might have been employed with low income or working for themselves and making a small amount of profits. They didn't pay national insurance, working abroad. All those kind of things can feed into why you may not get the full state pension. And then thirdly, and we've alluded to it briefly, is actually when you get the state pension, because at the moment, the state pension age is 66, but come 6th of April, that will start rising to 67 and then, further rises to 68 planned. And some people may be very happy working for that long, but others won't. So yes, I mean, I think don't underestimate the worth of the state pension, because if you were to try and build up a pension pot to pay you £12,500 a year, that would be quite a lot of money. But equally, it's for most people, is not going to give them the kind of lifestyle they want in retirement.
Sarah, I love that experiment, that week of living off the state pension. I might even give it a shot myself, although I don't think my family would thank me for it. So what would you say to someone who's a bit longer in the tooth and is going, it is too late?
Oh, it's never too late. It's never too early either. But, I think Sarah and I can hand on heart say that we've never met anyone who said that they wish they'd paid less into their pension. And, and I think Sarah's mentioned some of those things that, the benefits of starting earlier, that magic of time. But it doesn't matter when you pay into your pension, you'll get that tax relief. And, if you're an employee, then your employer will also pay into that pension for you. But I think if you are a bit later in your career, then remembering, see if you've got any lost pensions. That's, a top tip, that if you've had many jobs as well, sometimes people move house, they forget to tell their pension provider, they forget which pension provider the pension was with. So, remember that, to think about these, you can use the government pension tracing service. So that will give you contact details for the pension scheme. You just need to know the name of your old employer. Now, people can be really surprised by how much they've managed to track down. So, that's a really good tip about doing that. If you are later in your career, you might have got to kind of 50s, late 50s, and maybe you have paid off your mortgage, for example. So it might be that you instead of thinking, oh, I've got an extra £1,000 a month or however much, that you think, well, I've got an extra £500 a month, but I'll put £500 into my pension. Now, the closer you are to retirement, or the age when you can access money from your pension, the easier it is, because actually you might be over 55 right now, and paying that money in, you could actually take, some of your tax-free cash back out as well. So you can almost see the benefit because you're much closer to it. So, I definitely think about that. and Sarah's mentioned about the state pension. I think, remember, check your state pension record, just in case you do have any of those career breaks, you've been working abroad. You can usually buy voluntary contributions to fill them. And it's not much for the kind of, that's going to boost your state pension for life. So check your record. One other, kind of top tip is that if you're a grandparent under state pension age and you're caring for grandchildren, then you can apply for national insurance credits for that as well. So that could make a difference as well. Maybe you've not got those 35 years. So doing that, and lots of people don't know about this, so it's really worth thinking about it if you are in that situation.
This episode of the Investing Insiders podcast is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Saxo provides access to a broad range of global assets through a sophisticated trading platform. You can trade US stocks from as little as $1 per trade and UK stocks from $3 per trade. Please remember that all investing involves risk. The value of your investments can go down as well as up, and you could get back less than you invest. Terms and conditions apply. Visit Saxo Markets to learn more. Our discussion with Pete Glancy, Head of Pensions Policy at Scottish Widows, revealed why some of us might be falling short on retirement savings, even though we might have a workplace pension in place. He also shares some great tips on what we can do to fill the gap. In terms of people who are maybe not on track to hitting those figures, are we all generally, heading in the right direction? Or is there like a chunk of the population that might not actually reach that when they hit retirement age?
Well, at Scottish Widows, we conduct a massive programme of research each year. We survey 6,000 representative members of the British public, all walks of life and financial circumstances. And from what they tell us, we're able to predict the nation's preparedness for retirement. What we can see is that around about a third of the population who are going to be quite comfortable when they retire, and they tend to be in well-paid full-time jobs for most of their working lives. You've then got around about a third of the population who are going to have a very basic standard of living in retirement. They will be able to make ends meet, but there won't be any luxuries. They may not be able to continue to run a car. They may struggle to go on any foreign holidays at all. But unfortunately, we've also got around about a third of the population who won't even have enough to make that basic standard of living in retirement. They will need to think about working much later in life, potentially, than they want to. And they will also have to, rely on benefits, hoping that the country's still in good enough shape in the decades to come to be able to afford all of the benefits that the population might need.
That's quite a significant sum, and it potentially does open your eyes a little bit to the number of people who, just aren't necessarily putting enough away. What are some of the reasons why people might underestimate what they're putting into their pension, particularly if, say, they're already auto-enrolled or, they have a workplace pension where money's coming out? Could people in that position still be at risk of undersaving as well?
Oh, definitely. I think there's an assumption that if you've been auto-enrolled into a workplace pension, everything will be okay. People have seen their parents and their grandparents retiring. They've had a state pension, they've had a workplace pension, and they seem to be doing okay. But some of the pensions that those older generations retired with were final salary pensions, defined benefit pensions that gave you often 2/3 of the salary that you retired on. So they were very generous. Across the private sector, pretty much entirely in the entirety of the private sector, those final salary pensions don't exist anymore. So your pension is based on how much you and your employer put into what's known as a defined contribution pension. And the pension pots that they deliver are nowhere near as generous. So, for example, if you wanted to buy yourself the level of income that you would have traditionally had from a final salary scheme, between you and your employer, you would need to be putting about 30% of your salary for every year of your working life into a pension. Through auto-enrollment, the statutory level of savings is just 8%. So it's about a quarter of that amount. So the money going into DC pensions isn't going to buy you the sort of retirement incomes that you maybe saw your parents and your grandparents having.
That's quite a significant difference, 30 versus 8%. I guess anybody listening to those figures at the moment, might be thinking, well, what can I do? There is the statutory amount of auto-enrollment going out. And is there anything that you can action to maybe try and increase that if you can afford to?
Yes, so there's a number of things you can do. The last Retirement Commission ran between 2002 and 2006. And it gave us auto-enrolment, which was implemented between 2012 and 2017. And ever since then, most of us who are employed are contributing to a workplace pension. The level of savings at the time, when combined with the state pension, was designed to keep people out of poverty. There was an assumption that education, engagement, guidance and advice would encourage people to think about the additional amount that they would need to save on a voluntary basis, and that a lot of people would do that. It's that extra bit that hasn't happened. People haven't been engaged. People haven't saved any extra. So a few top tips. The first thing to think about is when you're young, you want to be thinking about pensions a bit like snowballs. If you roll a snowball down a hill, the longer it rolls, the bigger it gets. Pension contributions are a bit like that, with the compound growth from the investment return, so that a pound that you put in your early 20s will buy you 4 times as much retirement income as a pound you put in your late 50s. So if you can afford to put more in when you're young, it's worth doing it, even if you're on a smaller salary. The second thing to think about is that many employers, especially larger employers, will offer matched contributions and tiered levels of contributions. So you may be auto-enrolled at just 8%, but you can speak to your employer, and many of the larger employers especially will say, well, if you put a bit more in, we will also put a bit more in, and you can boost that contribution up to 12 or 15 or something higher if your employer operates an arrangement like that. So it's worth checking. And the third thing to do is to look at the level of volatility and risk. There are different ways in which your pension pot can be invested. So if you're taking a bit more investment risk, which normally gives a higher return in the long term, the value of your pension can go up and down over time. That's called volatility. Now, you don't want volatility when you're getting older and you're close to retirement, in case you're retiring at a trough in that volatility, you'll have a smaller pension pot. But when you're in your 20s and 30s, it doesn't really matter if the fund's going up and down a bit, if over the longer term it's giving you a higher level of return. So there's calculators that are available through your employer's side, through your pension scheme or provider's side, that help you understand your attitude to risk. And if you're younger, you've got a higher attitude to risk, it might be worth having a look at that.
I think it's great to hear the different tools and other things that are available to make sure that you get an understanding of where you're at, regardless of whether or not you've checked your pension before and it's completely new, or you're just trying to keep on top of it and take a look. From the research that Scottish Widows has done and anything else that you've read, are there any types of people in the workforce, or potentially who are self-employed, that are at greater risk of being underpensioned potentially?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. There's a very strong correlation between people who have well-paid full-time jobs for the majority of their career and good pension outcomes. So by definition, if you don't have that, you're going to have a poorer outcome. So we see women, for example, we issue a women in retirement report each autumn. Women are more likely to take time out of their careers to bring up children or look after elderly relatives, and that those career breaks mean that they have a smaller pension when they come to retire. People who have part-time jobs, there's an earnings trigger of £10,000. If you're not earning at least that, you don't get auto-enrolled, you don't get any pension contributions. And some people who are earning more than the average national wage are doing so between 2 or 3 part-time jobs. And it might be that those part-time jobs on their own, none of them are triggering the 10k contribution. But you can ask to be auto-enrolled if you are earning below 10k. So that's worth thinking about if you've got a number of jobs and you're not set up for a pension. And you did mention it, the self-employed. There's 4.5 million self-employed people in the UK at the moment. So auto-enrollment's been very successful in getting employed people into pensions. The system is really driven by payroll. So payroll systems that employers operate calculate how much you've earned, turn that from a percentage into a contribution and send it off to a pensions company. The self-employed don't have payroll systems. There isn't an ecosystem that would easily drive an equivalent of auto-enrollment for the self-employed. But we're certainly working with government and others to say, how can we build a similar ecosystem to auto-enrollment, but it will need to be tailored to meet the very specific needs of the self-employed.
Absolutely, because I guess with being self-employed and being an entrepreneur, there is that variation of income. So it's not as if you could say a certain amount could come out each month. Things could vary quite significantly. For people who are self-employed and thinking, okay, I really do want to make sure I set myself up for later life, what are some of the accounts or just processes that they can put in place to make sure that they're putting money aside and building that retirement pot for a comfortable, life when they hit pension age?
Well, the self-employed don't have auto-enrollment. Auto-enrollment applies to employees. And I guess the self-employed are probably more employers. It's a person that employs himself, basically. So they don't have employees as such. The way it works for employed people is you're either paid weekly or you're paid monthly, and you kind of budget on that basis. And your pension contributions are kind of worked out, based on your weekly and monthly budgets. But the self-employed often don't know how much they've got to play with for the longer term until the year end, until they've settled up corporation tax and VAT and the like and other expenses. So we need a different way of thinking about the self-employed. You don't have to use workplace pensions. Of course, there are personal pensions and SIPs which are available to the self-employed, and the pensions tax wrapper is still the most tax efficient in the long term if you're saving purely for retirement. What we also know about the self-employed, though, is that their personal finances and their business finances are much more likely to be completely intertwined. And the self-employed tell us that they can't always afford to lock up a very large amount of their capital, until age 55. They often want to put it into savings or investment vehicles, which give them access in the shorter or medium term if they get, left field bills coming in, etc. And so we probably need to think about a combination of products for the self-employed, savings and investment vehicles that give them some flexibility, combined with pensions vehicles, which are the best from the tax relief perspective.
Taking a step backwards and looking at property and the part that it could play in your pension planning and financial planning in retirement, how important then is it to kind of prioritize home ownership before heading into your retirement years?
Well, all of the calculations that the industry's done for the last 20 or 30 years and the government continues to do, when we're working out savings rates and contribution rates for pensions, we all assume that it's still the 1970s, that either people have paid off their mortgage when they retire or they're living in a council house. Now, neither of those things are true for everyone anymore. We sold off the council houses, and it's very difficult for people to get on the property ladder these days and own their own home. So it's much more common for people to be renting private rentals all the way through their retirement. And because people are getting onto the property ladder so late in life, they're carrying mortgages through their 60s and 70s and 80s. And the amount that we're saving for retirement was never designed to be paying mortgages right through to your 80s or to be paying very high private rents. If I give you an example of private rents, the average private rent in the northeast of England is 80% of the average pension income. In the south of England, it's 100% of the average pension income. And London is about 120% of the average pension income. So as we see more and more people renting in retirement, people just won't be able to make ends meet. So when you're in the earlier part of your life, you need to think about how am I going to get a balanced strategy to get onto the property ladder and hopefully have a home that I can live in without huge housing costs through retirement, and alongside that build up a reasonable pension pot. The people who will get into trouble will be the people who do all of one or all of the other. Because if you concentrate only on your pension, you will have a big pension, but all of that money is going to go on private rent. So that kind of defeats the purpose. And if you've ploughed all of your money into a big house, you're not going to have the income, to keep that house going when you come to retire. So it's all about getting a balance, not overstretching yourself on one or the other.
Is there one piece of pensions advice that you kind of wish everybody knew, or you think would kind of just help people, again, just feel a bit more empowered in managing their retirement income?
I think we just need to bust a few myths, if you like. There's myths that pensions are very expensive. There's lots of charges being taken out. The reality is that there's a charge cap of 0.75%, and most charges applying to workplace pensions are in the region of 0.3 to 0.4%. It's very small these days, so that's a myth that sometimes puts people off. People don't understand that there's tax relief. It's by far the most tax-efficient way of saving. People also think that pensions are risky because the money's invested. But if you leave your money in a bank account and there's no investment returns, the value of that money is decreasing in line with inflation. So let's say inflation is running at 5% per annum. After about 3 or 4 years, you've lost about 20% of the value. You're absolutely losing money in real terms, leaving it sitting in a bank. That's the most risky thing you could do if that money is intended for the long term. So we need people to understand that, pensions aren't expensive. There isn't the amount of risk attached to investments as people think, especially not as compared to a bank account. So those would be good myths to bust.
And finally, we recap our conversation with founder Hannah Martin, who at 47 realised she was on track for pension poverty. However, she managed to turn her story around and built up a pension pot of £460,000 in just 8 years. So, you've had quite an incredible journey when it comes to your pension and managed to turn a pretty bleak forecast into quite a sizable pot. So can you take us back to the moment you discovered that you were heading towards pension poverty? How did you find out and what triggered the wake-up call to make a change?
So I can actually, strangely, remember the exact moment. I was around my friend's house and she happened to just mention that I think she said about 500,000, that how much you need in your pension to retire. And I had never before considered that there was a target or a minimum amount. I'd always assumed, probably like many people, that the state pension was going to be enough. That obviously it's nicer to have more, but you can live on the state pension. And when she said that, I was aghast because at that point, I think I had about £1,000 in my pension.
What was the reason why you had so little in your pension?
So it's a really common story. So I remember in my 20s seeing a financial advisor and him showing me a chart of basically the earlier you started to save for a pension, the more you would have. And I got the concept, but when you're in your 20s, you've got so many things to spend money on. You don't have disposable income. And then I bought a house and then I had a baby and I was a single mum. And it felt like every penny that I earned was accounted for. That there wasn't that spare pot. I did actually work for advertising agencies that would match pension contributions. And I didn't start taking it up on it until just before I left, actually, which is the wrong time. Like years of opportunity. That's hence having a pension of £1,000. But it was just that classic kind of motherhood thing where I had a mortgage to pay. I was a single mum, so I had to pay all the bills. I had no pair. I didn't feel like I had money. I now know if I could go back, there's always, even if it's £25 a month or £50 a month, we can all find the money, by doing these is one less streaming subscription, for example, and putting that in a pension instead. I would do that now. But at the time, I felt like pension wasn't a priority. Like I said, I had these assumptions that there would somehow magically be enough. So why would I divert money that could go elsewhere into a pension?
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you say that because I think one of the mistakes that we see women make is that they rely on their husband's pension. But you were saying that you were a single mum, so you didn't even have that fallback. And I think, I mean, when you're in your 20s, retirement feels so far away. And every single penny can be accounted for in other areas. And I know exactly, because I'm going to be honest, I fell into the same trap myself. And you go, oh God, I should really, no, because this is more urgent now. And I can deal with that at a later stage when that becomes more urgent. At that time, what was your relationship with money on a day-to-day basis? Were you sort of avoidant or optimistic or anxious or, what kind of a relationship did you have then?
Probably optimistic, as in I just felt it was going to be okay. I have actually always been good with money, hence why I've been able to build a pension pot up now, because I've always lived below my means ever since. I remember there's in my family, it's a classic story. I've got a sister who's 18 months younger, very different with money. And we were both at uni and we got a summer job working in a fridge making factory in Bognor for 6 weeks. And it was, oh my God, it was just assembling one part in a fridge 8 hours a day for 6 weeks. It was so mind-numbing. And the thing is, she was saving the money to pay back the fund that she'd had the previous year at uni. I was saving up because at the end of the 6 weeks, I spent a month traveling around America. So I had been really financially cautious throughout that year. I'd lived within my means. So I was saving up to go away and she was earning the money to pay back the funds she already had. And that really is how I am. I'm quite happy to live below my means for something in the future. So I've got that good relationship with money. I just didn't save because I thought I was optimistic. I thought it would be fine.
I think that's something that applies to a lot of people, in that the idea that it's just all going to work itself out and, eventually things are just going to come together. I kind of had a similar situation when I had my first two, quote unquote proper jobs, where I was looking at the pension contributions coming out and I was like, it's just not going to balance the books right now. Like I'm just going to have to, opt out of, auto enrollment, and eventually there'll come a point where I can actually stick in and it's all going to be affordable. But there is that very real thing that your current financial, expenses, they do take priority. Like you do have to pay for your housing, you do have to pay for your bills and everything. So I think that makes a lot of sense. When it came to sort of switching gears and really putting yourself towards building your pension pot, what were some of the strategies that you used to really build up?
I guess I didn't really have a strategy. I think I already had a pension because that £1,000 existed. And so I remember having a conversation with my accountant, and the company was starting to make money. And obviously it was £45,000, now it's 60,000. There's a maximum you could put into a pension. And in its simplistic terms, it comes off your corporation tax. That money isn't taxed. And it made sense to do that with the money because otherwise I was going to get taxed on that money. And I lived frugally for so long. My business didn't make money for a long time. So I was used to living on very little money. And I just thought, I'm quite happy. I spend on the things I enjoy, which are quite simple things. So instead of taking that money out of the business, being taxed on it, and maybe increasing my standard of living, which I wouldn't have been any happier, I would have just had small money to spend. Why don't I put it in my pension? So I just put it in the pension I already had. And so year on year, I was maxing out my tax allowance and putting it in the pension. That was the strategy. It wasn't a very complex, sophisticated one. If anyone's listening to this and thinking, I have no clue about money, I did a fine art degree and now I became a writer. I am not someone who is naturally interested in finance. And I think that's what makes me potentially good to go and talk about it, because I'm not a financial expert. I've become interested in it because it relates to how I want to live my life. It has a direct impact. And if I don't understand these things in a small way, I only know what I want, what I need to know. That's it. And it's enough that I can make educated decisions. So yeah, no one needs to be a financial expert. They just need to know enough.
I think that's such a valid point, especially the sense of just simplifying everything. It really doesn't have to be that complicated. Like a pension helps you fund your life through retirement. What do you want that life to look like? That's going to influence how much you need to have saved away. It sounds like you've just had, the most incredible journey in terms of turning your pension savings around and building something for the life that you want in the future too. Is there anything, if you could go back in time and, maybe talk to your 20-year-old self, is there anything that you would have done differently at that point when it came to pensions?
Well, yes, start one then and put money into it then. Even £10 a month, £20 a month, anyone can find that realistically. I know anyone, most people can find that. Even if it just means, as I said, like buying one less thing or buying something cheap at the supermarket. But most people can find £10, £20 a month. Even that a small amount would have given me a start then.
Yeah. Actually, we should do the maths one day. I'm sure I have at some point, but over how long, if you started in your 20s, what would you need to put away each month to get to that $500,000 mark? It wouldn't be an awful lot. It's quite extraordinary. Like that's what I think people don't realize is how small an amount that you can actually get away with in order to build it. I mean, obviously there are circumstances like how you're invested and things like that will affect your outcomes. But generally speaking, you can put an average on pension growth for the last sort of few years and just go with that sort of number. But yeah, it's an extraordinary story that because I think one of the endearing things about this story is that you did it later on in life at a time when so many people just go, oh, it's too late. I can't do that now. I'm not going to be able to make any kind of significant impact. But even if you don't make a significant impact, I think any kind of impact is better because you just don't know what is coming around the corner or what you might need even if you manage to save £10,000 or, £20,000. I mean, obviously you've gone for $500,000, which is an absolute,
incredible.
To that. It'll take most people a lot longer to get to that. But I think one of the important things that you said there is that that did not come without sacrifice. And you prioritized your pension. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, is that they don't prioritize it. And it's too easy to put off. But auto-enrollment's actually done quite a good job for this country on that.
But I think that it has, but I think it has lulled people into a false sense of security to a degree, because they think auto-enrollment is enough. That's it, because it's not enough. It's still not going to get you to where you need to be according to retirement living standards. So I think it is a great start, but people also still need to take action for themselves. I would say to anyone, even if you think you've left it late, just Google free compound interest calculator, and then look at sort of, I usually do about 5% interest, but actually long-term pensions I think they average at 7% long-term, 5% short-term, don't they? Around that. But I go around 5%, and then just put if I put £10 a month in now or £100 a month in now over, let's say 15 years, how much would I have then? That is a good motivator for taking action.
Thank you so much for joining our Investing Insiders podcast. If you like the episode, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on your platform of choice. For the latest money news and deals, you can sign up to our weekly newsletter at investinginsiders.co.uk/newsletter-page. We've also got a suite of guides, tools and calculators on our website at investinginsiders.co.uk. You can also keep up to date with us on TikTok, Instagram and YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode.